Hi, and welcome to Truth Matters. My name is Lynn, and with this podcast, I'm hoping to shine a light on a range of topics, whether Irish, regional, or global, and whether environmental, cultural, or political. Because the truth matters. In this episode of Truth Matters, Elections and Corruptions, I want to take a look at the different systems of elections worldwide, how effective they are, and what problems may be encountered. And what about those donations and campaign finances? How do they differ around the world? And who can vote? And then there's corruption. How is that working out these days? And has our idea of what constitutes ethical behaviour shifted? Doing an overview of elections. So the Athenians were one of the first groups to vote in the 6th century, although they preferred assemblies as they considered them more inclusive. For a few centuries, from the 1200s, successive rounds of drawing lots in Venice were deemed a successful way of reflecting all opinions. But current electoral systems in countries will require a set of rules that decide when elections occur. Who decides? Is it a stated amount of time or only however long a party holds a majority? Who is allowed to vote? Is it universal or selective suffrage from age 16 in some countries? Any groups ruled out, like bankrupts or military? Is it mandatory voting, like Australia? Who can stand as a candidate? Is there a minimum age requirement or a minimum degree of support required? How are ballots cast? Postal ballots, online ballots, absentee ballots. If in person, is it in private booths done manually on paper ballots or by a machine? Is political party merchandise banned within and around the immediate area of a polling station? How are ballots counted? Who or what does the counting? What are their requirements? Who oversees the count? Who makes decisions on spoiled votes? And who has access to view the count? How do the votes translate into election outcome? Mainly dependent on the type of voting system embraced by a country or region or a local council. And are there reserved seats, like Morocco, where 60 seats are reserved for women voted for on a separate ballot? And are there limits on campaign spending? We'll look later at that eye-opener of a subject. The results determine which political party is elected, or parties if a coalition, who will then govern. There are many different voting systems around the world, ranging from the first-past-the-post system to the single transferable vote, which is a form of proportional representation, or PR, and some hybrid versions in between. Looking at the ratings of these voting systems used by the Electoral Reform Group in the UK, there are 3 categories to be assessed, each of which can have a maximum of 5 stars: proportionality, voter choice, and local representation. So 15 stars would be the top score. The lowest score of 7 stars goes to the first-past-the-post voting system, which is used in the UK and India. It is the simplest in as much as whoever gets the most votes wins the seat, but it is the least representative, with only 2 stars for proportionality, 2 stars for voter choice, and 3 stars for local representation. The alternative vote system, used in Australia, where the majority vote wins the seat, gains an extra star for local representation, amassing 9 stars in all. Party-less proportional representation, with 10 stars undertaken in Israel and Norway, closely matches how many votes each party receives, with 5 stars for proportionality, but doesn't do too well in voters' choice and even less in local representation. A similar result, with 10 stars, is the additional member system used in Germany. But the single transferable vote used in Ireland gets the most stars at 14, with 4 for proportionality and a top 5 stars each for voter choice and local representation. This PR balloting allows for inclusion of minority parties, even if this tiered voting can be a bit of a headache, ranking in order from 1, your favourite, to 10, maybe a candidate you despise, but you're encouraged to fill in all 10 placements anyway. So, what problems may be encountered at election time? UN observers are often assigned to countries to observe at election polling stations and counting districts when there are concerns about vote buying or ballot stuffing, impersonation, and or intimidation outside the election area. Triggered by the 2020 US presidential election, it has also become more popular to decry the results of elections, maintaining voter fraud and votes not being counted properly. Vote rigging was always perceived as a developing country problem, but the European Digital Media Observatory in 2023 tracked 11 elections in 10 European countries and recorded 4 stories in each election, claiming voter fraud, foreign influences, and unfair practices being shared online. The end result was to decrease trust in all aspects of the election process. But spare a thought for the election officials overseeing elections, ensuring that they are transparent, fair, accurate, and in compliance with the law. A 2024 survey published by IDEA, the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, based in Sweden, reports too many have been faced with aggression, threats, harassment, and an increased number of online attacks, particularly gender-based disinformation against women. All of this undermines democracy, and it is too often enacted by individuals or entities with that aim in mind. From my last podcast, Lies, Damn Lies and Troll Farms, I outlined how the disinformation machine really gets into overdrive during elections, with concerted attempts to sway public opinion. Check out the fact checkers, because the trolls are often having a field day in the run-up to an election, then casting doubt about results. And as an aside, there's a fabulous book called The Merchants of Doubt that kicks off with the antics of the tobacco industry in the creation of doubt to effectively undermine research and delay any regulation of the industry. A playbook which was subsequently also used by the pharmaceutical, fossil fuel, and food industries. And we're still battling, or not, as the case may be, with lobbyists to try and get some control over these toxic Goliaths. So is gerrymandering a universal problem? The tweaking of district borders to facilitate advantage by one political party over another has been going on for centuries and is rampant in some countries like the US or Hungary, although some will claim it's a case of swings and roundabouts, depending who has the majority in a district at any one time. But it does create divisions and resentments, even if the outcomes are proportional, but particularly if the result is widely off kilter, maybe excluding minorities, which further undermines trust in politics. Now, I want to take a look at donations and campaign finances and how they differ around the world. Generally referred to as political donations, campaign finances, and election finances, these monies ostensibly cover campaign costs like travel, staff, political consulting, and advertising. Out of the 38 OECD countries assessed by Transparency International for campaign donations, half of them have limits on spending, which means half of them don't. Caps on political donations can help to ensure a level playing field by upholding political equality and limiting the influence of wealthy individuals, corporations, or unions. Allowed campaign donations range dramatically, from Ireland and Iceland with their low-level cap to the US with a whole gamut of restrictions depending on donor and recipient, extending from $2,000 per election from a candidate committee to unlimited transfers of hundreds of millions of dollars to from PACs, the political action committees. And with this drastic increase in campaign donations over successive US elections, it is estimated that $15.9 billion was spent on the 2024 election between the presidential and congressional campaigns. What you could do with that amount of money invested in health or education. The US relies heavily on private donors, and individual political donations can run into hundreds of millions of dollars. And it is estimated that US electoral candidates spend quarter to half of their campaign time fundraising. Critics say that such immense campaign financing allows the candidate to be beholden to their funder or donor, the electorate to be bought, and much of the estimated over $1 billion dark money spent on political campaigns being exempt from oversight. The immense amount of monies involved allows special interest groups to saturate the political marketplace with their dominating influence and policies that generally favour the rich. And after the fact, government contracts can be handed out or withheld according to the donation history of the contractor. The problem is being exacerbated in the US, where Congress should have oversight, but appears to be relinquishing that responsibility and allowing the firing of inspector generals, the closure of the Office of Government Ethics, and the Attorney General being a personal friend of the president. At the other end of the scale, Ireland deems that a TD, that's a national candidate for a member of parliament, for a parliamentary seat, can receive a maximum donation of €2,500 from an individual or companies annually, and spend no more on their election than €58,350 for the largest constituencies. Corporate donors wishing to donate more than €200, yes, that's 200 full stop euros, not 200 million, must register with the Standards Committee every year that they are donating. The Irish presidential campaign allows for greater finance spending, limited to €750,000 per candidate, although I doubt that much is spent on each candidate yet. Musk and friends are hoping his money will swing the results of the next Irish presidential election. Stay away, please. To confuse the issue, the UK has no cap on campaign donations, which makes for interesting situations in Ireland, as a party like Sinn Féin, which is an all-Ireland party, i.e. both Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, can access its coffers in Northern Ireland, which has no cap on donations, for the elections in the Republic, while most political parties of the Irish Republic are under the strict system of cap donations. And who can vote? Universal suffrage is still not absolute. It took decades, centuries even, of women and minorities campaigning for the right to vote for it to be enacted. And even then, it was occasionally rescinded when some men thought better of it. The women's suffrage movement took hold by the early 1900s, with the Isle of Man proving that it embraced women, being an early adopter in 1881, followed by New Zealand in 1893. Australia allowed women to vote in 1902, but excluded Indigenous Australians until 1966. Canada was a similar story. In 1918, the UK allowed women over 30 who had property or university education to vote, eventually allowing all to vote by 1928. The US extended voting rights to some women by 1920, whilst full suffrage came about in 1965. Switzerland was the bastion of resistance for voting rights for women, allowing federal votes in 1971, but several cantons resisted, the last holding out until 1990. That's only 35 years ago. In 1930, South Africa allowed European and Asian women to vote, but this was only extended to all in 1994. But women and minorities are still excluded in some countries. In Afghanistan, women were allowed to vote in 1919, but then elections were abolished 10 years later, then reinstated, then revoked by the Taliban in 1996. And now women are not even allowed to speak outside of their home. Eritrea has had no elections since independence in 1993. Obviously, a different definition of independence than the one I'm familiar with. And some countries like Saudi Arabia do not even hold national elections, as they are absolute monarchies. And then there's corruption. How is that working out these days? A chorus from society will often say that all politicians are corrupt, and this is patently not true, with many individuals and even some parties embracing integrity as part of their political message. But all that gets lost in the buzz of corruption soundbites, which are much more exciting in newsworthy terms for the populist media and the trolls. However, those sleazy or unethical politicians taint the records of all politicians, with many being accused over the years of taking money for access, succumbing to the lures of lobbying by corporate giants, pocketing brown envelopes, and making immense profits with insider trading picks from the knowledge gleaned at official meetings. The Corruption Perception Index by Transparency International gives an indication into a country's standing. Marked out of 100, above 90 is considered a transparent and least corrupt country. but the global average only reached 43. It appears we are a planet of corrupt governances. Only one country scored 90, and that was Denmark. It was all downhill from there. Ireland just squeaked in at 10th with a score of 77. The UK was 20th with a score of 71, and the US numbered 28 with a score of 65. A mixed bag of results for the EU countries, and they'll be looked at separately for an episode on the EU. Bottom of the league was South Sudan with a score of only 8, just topped by Somalia with 9 and Venezuela with 10 points. For people living in the majority of countries, corruption is the accepted norm, even if it is not considered acceptable. So has our idea of what constitutes ethical behaviour shifted? Thomas Davis, the young islander, wrote in the mid-1800s, "The problems of modern times, both at home and abroad, suggest that there remains a need for moral leaders to work for the common good, rather than political faction or narrow self-interest. Knowledgeable and just leaders will always be required to uphold the principles of democracy." Those words are even more relevant now. Corruption used power or authority for personal gain, often through illegal, immoral, or unethical means. Once upon a time, and it is beginning to feel like a fairy story, it was considered an obvious conflict of interest if political leaders in the Western world tried to use their office of power for personal gain. However, direct personal enrichment is now being adopted by countries that we previously considered mainly ethical, and it is being entrenched into the governance. Yet, countries like Canada, New Zealand, and most EU countries are considered stable, with checks and balances in place and the rule of law still embraced. Ethical governments follow a set of moral principles and values, thus promoting trust in its integrity, objectivity, accountability, and impartiality. Ireland has the Corruption Offences Act of 2018, with penalties for offering gifts as bribes or to exert improper influence. Depending on the offence, there can be unlimited fines and imprisonment for up to 10 years. Not that many have been fined or imprisoned, although 5 senior bankers were imprisoned for sham transactions uncovered by the financial crash of 2008. The 2 most senior from Anglo-Irish Bank fleeing to the US prior to extradition. The ex-chief has since been released and is reportedly living in a €2 million mansion in Dublin. By comparison, Iceland jailed 29 financial bosses for their role come the financial crash of 2008. Elsewhere? Who knows? And let us remember the antics of Mr. Goo-Boo himself, Charles Haughey, former Irish Taoiseach, that's the Prime Minister of the 80s, who had to ultimately resign after years in office to then be beset by financial scandals and tribunals. Whilst preaching belt tightening and employing budget cuts as a national policy, he lived a luxurious lifestyle with his yacht and island retreat and received millions from various business benefactors. And this was the 80s. Having been accused of personal vanity, historian Dermot Ferreter said of Charles Haughey, "Once he became leader, All he was concerned with was staying leader. It was always about the cult of leadership. His sense of himself was much more important than any vision he had for the country. He was a forerunner of the similarly flamboyant style of governing embraced by some contemporary leaders. Corrupt behaviour generally trickles down from the leader of a group to be embraced by the followers and supporters, and eventually deemed acceptable within that grouping. Just because lots of people appear to be doing it or accepting it does not make it right. There are times when following the ethos of culturally accepted norms is not the ethical choice. So, is the offer from an overseas country of a flying palace with $400 million worth of technology on board and every conceivable mod cotton a gift, a bribe, a reward, an IOU, a thank you note, or the largest of all possible kickbacks? If eventually donated to the Presidential Library, can it be taken out for 3 weeks? And will there be a fine if not returned on time? Despite obvious conflicts of interest, a city president is blatantly mixing family business with the country's affairs and adding billions to the family coffers by developing bitcoins, stable coins, golf courses and hotels in the Gulf states and elsewhere. There are even meme coins now for sale, alongside all the other merchandising options to fill the family coffers. And maybe the worst aspect of the rules being flouted in such a brazen manner, of claiming transparency because it is not being concealed, is that this will empower the strong men of the world to take or do whatever they want. What was once thought of as behaviour so unacceptable as to be thought impossible to be undertaken has been rebranded as businesslike. An indication of what would be coming down the line was earlier this year when US companies were no longer in violation of if they use slush funds, because doesn't everyone use slush funds? Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So said Lord Acton in 1887. We are in the midst of an absolute power resurrection. So if we don't want to be reduced to mere vassals of our overlords, or overladies, as the case may be, get to the polls and uphold integrity. This is Lynn, signing off with another episode in the Democracy Matters series of Truth Matters. And thank you for listening. Until the next time.